Uh, I started the name Formal Methods Update, but yeah, I think this has really evolved into a very nice series. Am I audible, Madhavan?
Yeah,
Hello?
we can hear you clearly. Yeah.
And you can see my screen too also, right?
Yeah. Just move the slide so that you can check that it moves.
Uh,
Yeah.
does it? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Perfect. Yeah. Go ahead. Start.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Madhavan, for the introduction, and welcome to the second day of the Formal Methods Update meeting. I think it has really evolved into a very nice format. So I'm going to talk today about this problem called Boolean functional synthesis, on which we have been working for a few years now. And I'm going to talk about a particular method that has turned out to be reasonably effective for this problem. And this is called counterexample guided repair. I'm going to explain what this means as we go along in the talk. And this is joint work with Akshay, Ajit, and Sheetal. And I'm also going to talk towards the end about work that we have not done in our group, but it has been done in another group, which also falls in the same paradigm. Okay, so let's get going. So what is the synthesis, what is the Boolean functional synthesis problem, or what is the synthesis problem in general? So we want to design a system, a box that we don't know how it should, what its internals should be. But we know that it has some inputs labeled x1 to xn, and it has some outputs labeled y1 to ym. And we have a specification that the inputs and outputs must satisfy, and the specification is given in some formula in some logic phi. So our goal is to automatically synthesize the system such that the specification phi is always satisfied. And of course, we will see that sometimes the specification phi may be given in a way that it is not always possible to satisfy it, and I'm going to define precisely what this means. So our goal would be to synthesize the system whenever it is possible. So effectively what we are saying is that can we get y's as functions of possibly the history of the values of x and y, which could be summarized in the state of the system. And we would like y's as functions of these history. I mean, in general, it could be the history. It could, in a simpler case, it could also just be the values of x at the current point of time. But in general, it could be the history of x and y. Okay, so here are some concrete instantiations of this template that I just showed. So for example, suppose I have my specification as this LTL formula, which says that it is always the case that if x1 becomes true now, then at some future point y1 becomes true, and similarly for x2 and y2. And it is never the case that y1 and y2 are true at the same time. So you can think of this as the specification for a simple arbiter, where x1 and x2 are the requests and y1 and y2 are the grants. So we are saying that if a request comes from requester 1, it should be granted to requester 1 at some point, and similarly for requester 2. But of course, both requesters 1 and 2 cannot be granted at the same time. So we would like to synthesize these outputs y as functions of the state summarizing the history of x and y. Now, a very standard way of solving this kind of temporal synthesis problem is to sort of pose it as a game between the environment which provides the inputs and the system which generates the outputs. And so if you think of it as a game between these two players, the environment and the system, then we can draw the game graph of it. And the game graph kind of might look something like this, depending on various states. So for example, here I have labeled states with blue outgoing edges as states from which the environment is making the move, and states with red outgoing edges as states from which the system is making a move. So our game graph could be something like this. And then, a very standard way of solving these problems is that we, formulate it as this two-player game, construct the game graph, and within the game graph, we identify what is called the winning region. So here, in an abstract sense, I have sort of colored some states and saying that consider this as the winning region. So what is the winning region? The winning region is such that once you get into these states, no matter what the environment does, the system always has an action that it can take such that the specification will be satisfied. The specification cannot be violated. So for example, if you look at, is my cursor visible? I'm not sure if Zoom shows the cursor.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So for example, if you look at this state, this is a state from which the environment is making a move. So it can move here or it can move here. But, once it comes here, then the system has this option of making this move such that, from this state, no matter what the environment does, we are still in the green states, the winning region, right? The system also had the option of making this move, but this would have taken it out of the winning region. But, the winning region's definition is that at every state where the system is supposed to make a move, the system has at least one move to make such that it stays within the winning region and it cannot be thrown out of the winning region. For example, this state is not one such state because no matter what the system does over here, it is outside of the winning region. Okay. So a very standard way of solving these temporal synthesis problems is to construct this game graph, find out the winning region from here. And once you have the winning region, you basically synthesize what is called a winning strategy such that the system makes a move such that it always stays within the winning region. Now, once I've come to this point, once I've constructed the winning region, the synthesis of this winning strategy can be thought of as saying that let us look at this formulation where let's say next state is a function which takes the current state, which takes the move of the system, and it gives me the next state. So this is the next state function applied to states from which the system has a move. So if I give it the state, if I give it the move of the system, it gives me what the next state is. And winning region is a predicate which evaluates to true for the green region, for the green states, and evaluates to false for the non-green states. So what I want is that for every state from which the system should make a move, the move of the system should be such that the next state always falls within the winning region. So really the winning strategy is synthesize y as a function of state such that this is always true. But if you look at this, there is a very interesting property here that there are no temporal operators here. Next state is a completely combinational function. Given a state, given the move of the system, it tells you what the next state is. And winning region is a predicate which takes a state of the system and tells me whether it's in the winning region or not. So you can see that I've reduced the temporal synthesis problem through this winning region construction to a synthesis problem where I still have to synthesize y as a function of state, but I don't need to worry about temporal operators. And of course, it could also be the case, for example, here are some states from which no matter what y you take, you cannot satisfy this formula. So, this may not always be satisfiable, but this is reality. I mean, specifications are not always satisfiable. Here is another example, and this is also an interesting example, another instantiation of the same template that I showed you at the beginning. So here what is happening is my specification is in terms of an input, which is a 2n-bit vector, and two outputs, which are two distinct n-bit vectors. And the relation between the input and the output that I want to be satisfied is the following, that the input should be the product of the outputs, the n-bit integer product of the output, and none of the outputs should be the constant 1. So this 1 sub n means it's the bit vector of width n which represents the constant 1. So if you look at this specification for a minute, what you'll realize is that we are actually asking something very difficult. We are saying that the system here should really be doing a non-trivial factorization of its input. And right. And of course, this specification has no temporal operators in it. And of course, it may not always be satisfiable also. For example, if I give x as a prime number, then there are no non-trivial factors of prime numbers. So, what I'm trying to drive at here is that synthesis problem, whether you start from temporal synthesis, reactive synthesis, or just synthesis problems like this, they eventually can be reduced to the problem of synthesizing outputs from inputs where there are no temporal operators, and it may not always be satisfiable. And so this is kind of, and of course, in this case, if we really had an efficient solution for this, we know that this would break crypto systems because this is effectively doing non-trivial factorization, right? In crypto systems, this number is basically the product of two primes. So there is really a unique factorization of it. And if we can do this non-trivial factorization, we would have we would have extracted out the two primes from X. So this also hints that this problem that we're trying to attempt, even if there are no temporal operators, is not going to be easy to solve, because an easy solution would immediately have a lot of ramifications. So, okay, with those motivations, hopefully I have been able to convince you that.
So, Shiva, Supratik, I think Raghavan has raised his hand.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I can't see hand raises. Yeah.
Yeah. Supratik, in that example about the arbiter, one trivial solution seems to be that every state be in the winning region, but that is intuitively not correct. So I was not sure how you ruled out such wrong solutions.
Every state is the winning region.
That would be a wrong solution, but the formulation on the right seems to admit that, unless I'm missing something.
But it has to satisfy the specification.
How did you encode that in that?
No, this is just an illustrative representation. This is just to show what happens in game graphs. But in general, from certain states, you may not have this. That the specification there may be no path starting from that state which will satisfy this.
I understand that. I do not understand how you encoded the temporal specification into the non-temporal. You said that the final formulation is non-temporal.
Yeah.
So I do not understand how you encoded
the construction of the winning region. Is that you're asking? How do we construct the winning region?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is okay. I could go into this. This is kind of orthogonal to this talk, but this is a very standard construction. So you basically take the entire game graph and you ask from which states do I have paths with.
So are you saying that the winning region has to be constructed explicitly first, and then only you can make this formulation on the bottom right?
Yes, either explicitly or symbolically. So the winning region has to be, so this temporal synthesis problem, the strategy that I'm talking about, or the approach that I'm talking about, has these two steps. The first is the construction of the winning region, and the second is the synthesis of the winning strategy.
Fine. Okay. I thought you were rolling them into one step somehow.
No. Oh, so sorry. So there are these two steps, and what I'm saying is that so the construction of the winning region is a separate process, and I didn't get into how to do that, but it is basically some kind of a reachability process. You basically identify states that already satisfy this, and then you sort of build a kind of fixed point starting from there.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So this, if you found the winning region, then what, isn't the synthesis job also done?
Well, now, so this could be a symbolic winning region. This may not be an explicit winning region. This whole game graph might be constructed symbolically. The winning region might be obtained symbolically. And now you have to find out from each state what is the output that you should take. So for example, when you are in this state, this is the output that you should generate, and you should not generate this output. Okay, so the predicate just tells you these are the combinations of whatever values of the signals, and this state is in the winning region, right?
Okay, but when one synthesizes, when you do that fixed point, computation of the winning region, I think you also get the winning strategy.
No, the fixed point computation is just it's a fixed point computation, right? So you start from some states, and then you say, okay, what are the predecessor states, which, depending on whether it's a move of the environment or a move of the system, you sort of consider, you expand it such that you consider all possible edges or some edges and so on and so forth. If you're saying that you're going to keep track of what is happening from each state, this will not be even feasible if you're doing this symbolically, right? You at any point of time, you have a symbolic representation of the winning region, and then you're trying to expand that winning region. And that symbolic representation of the winning region could have many, many states represented within it.
Okay.
So when you expand it, you're just applying the symbolic transition relations, computing images, quantifying out. is the usual symbolic fixed point computation. So that does not tell you what you must do from an individual state. It gives you the next set of states in the fixed point computation, but it does not necessarily tell you what is the next set of states. What is the move from each state. The winning region computation is a calculation on sets of states. And of course, to go from one set of states to another set of states in this fixed point calculation, you will have to do some, you'll have to apply the transition relations, that are affected by the system's moves and that are affected by the environment's moves. But you're inherently talking about a set of states. You're not talking about one state at a time.
Okay.
Does it make it? Yeah. If you are doing this explicitly, I agree, then you already have, then there's nothing more to do after that. If you construct this graph explicitly. Yeah, so Madhavan, I'm not able to see the chat. If there is
yeah, so I'll keep track of it.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, this one somebody told me, so it's not that I kept track of it, but I'll do it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so does that answer your question, Deepak?
Yeah. I think that clarifies it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for symbolic, winning region calculations, this still remains a problem that from each state I have to find out what output to generate, and that's the problem.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So here is the Boolean functional synthesis problem. So we are now talking about a Boolean relation which does not have any temporal operators in it. And we want to synthesize functions for each of the outputs in terms of only the inputs, such that for every valuation of the inputs, if there is some way to set the outputs such that the specification is satisfied, then there is the values that the outputs would take if I use these functions for the outputs would also satisfy the specification. Of course, this implication going from this side to this side is trivial. I mean, if I already have F1 to Fm satisfy the specification, then there indeed exists Y1 to Ym, which satisfies this specification. So the really non-trivial part of this implication is going from the left side to the right side. And that's saying that for every possible input, if there is some way to set the outputs such that the specification is satisfied, setting the outputs as per the functions Fi's also satisfies the specification. And note that these functions are also called Skolem functions in the literature. So the Skolem functions for the Yj's. And we could very well have a specification. For example, actually both the examples that I showed, there could be some inputs for which there are no outputs. Like I could give you a prime number and then there is no way to do a non-trivial factorization. Right. So what do we do in such cases? I mean, does the problem become uninteresting? So we say that it's not uninteresting. I guess the factorization problem indeed shows that although it doesn't, although if X is a prime, there is no meaningful way to get Y, but it's still important because, perhaps the useful cases are when X is not a prime. And perhaps the useful cases are when X is just a product of two primes. So it's interesting as long as there are some inputs for which, this stays meaningful. And for such inputs for which this problem is meaningful, Fx must give the right value of Y for all such X. And for the other inputs where it is not meaningful, we don't care. For example, if X is a prime number, we don't care what Fx turns out to be. Okay. And of course, once I have this function Fx, I can easily check whether there exists Y phi xy is true, because all I can do is in place of Y, I can substitute Fx and then just evaluate this for a given X. And if it evaluates to 0, I know that for X, there is no such Y such that phi xy would be true. Okay. So this is the formal problem formulation. This is the Boolean functional synthesis problem that I'm going to talk about subsequently. So I hope all of us are on the same page with respect to the problem definition. Now, there are several applications of this.
Supratik.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you don't admit the history view, is it? It has to be on the current symbols, is it?
So as I said, the temporal synthesis problem after the winning region calculation
Okay.
comes to the state. So this state has the history.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Shibashish, go ahead.
Yeah, so in the next slide, when you had the fj of x here,
This one?
yeah, so I did not fully follow why you have like fj of x for each yj.
For each output, I need a function.
So for each output variable, you need a separate function.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and
so you can think of this specification as an n input n input m output specification.
I see. Okay.
And for each of those m outputs, I need a function in terms of the inputs.
Okay. 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 Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah. So I was saying that this has a lot of applications, including in cryptanalysis, disjunctive decomposition of transition relations, quantifier elimination, of course. These Scholim functions also serve as certificates in QBF SAT solving, reactive controller synthesis once we have constructed the winning region, and program synthesis, synthesis of circuits, repair of circuits, and so on. And of course, there have been a lot of approaches earlier. I mean, we are certainly not the first ones. In fact, this goes back to more than 100 years, where actually even before Scholim came into the scene, there was a closely related problem called Boolean unification, and there is some very close connections between the Scholim function generation problem and Boolean unification. Then, of course, if this formula for all x exists y, phi x, y is valid, which means for every x I can find a y, then once I have the proof of validity of this, from the proof of validity, the Scholim functions can be extracted. This has been a very successful line of work, but this doesn't work when for every x there does not exist a y. People have used templates, people have used what is called self-substitution and function composition. Others, and even we have also used special normal form representations. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, from which synthesis becomes simple. Incremental determinization. The specification can be thought of as a non-deterministic specification of what the output should be given some inputs. And so you incrementally determinize it to get the outputs as functions of the inputs. Quantifier instantiation techniques, of course. Things about, we can separate the specification into input and output components. But what I'm going to focus on in this talk, in the remaining half an hour or so, is what is called this paradigm, where we guess or learn some Scholim function candidate, and then we check whether it works or not. And if not, we go ahead and repair it. And of course, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this repair, but I'm going to go through all of these 3 steps. And we have done some work on it, and others have also done work on this paradigm. Okay, so how hard or easy is this function, this Boolean functional synthesis problem, which I denote as BFNS? So in order to answer this question, we have to first agree on how the specifications and the Scholim functions will be represented. So we agree that we are going to represent these as Boolean circuits, which are DAGs with and, or, and not labeled nodes. And we are going to represent the input as a circuit which takes the system inputs and the system outputs as inputs to the specification circuit, and it generates a single value saying whether the specification is satisfied or not. The output will, of course, be a vector of functions. Each of these functions will in general have all the inputs as the inputs to the circuit. And there will be y such circuits, so there could be one circuit which has y such outputs. Okay, and if you agree, if we agree that this is how we are going to represent specifications and Scholim functions, then it is not hard to show that this problem is NP-hard, which means that it's going to be difficult to get a polytime algorithm. But then the next question we can ask is that, well, even if I were to spend exponential time solving this, can I get compact Scholim functions always? And unfortunately, the answer to that is the negative. But the important thing there is that The lower bound results in circuit size don't directly apply here, because the lower bound results in circuit size refer to monotone circuits. And what is a monotone circuit? The monotone circuit is one where the output can't change from 1 to 0 if the input changes from 0 to 1. So basically, if the inputs are monotonically increasing, the outputs can only monotonically increase. And note that there is no restriction that we have put that Skolem function should be monotone. So clearly this argument about exponential lower bounds for monotone circuits, which is a well-known result, does not directly apply to the Skolem function synthesis problem. But nevertheless, we were able to show that unless the polynomial hierarchy collapses, there exist specs for which every Skolem function that you synthesize must have superpolynomial size. And unless the non-uniform exponential time hypothesis fails, there exist specifications for which every Skolem function that you synthesize must be exponential size. So these are conditional lower bounds, but these are well-regarded complexity conjectures. So polynomial hierarchy collapsing would have a lot of other implications. So I think superpolynomial certainly looks like a plausible thing for here. So, all of this says that we can't get efficient time-wise or size-wise. So efficient algorithms for Boolean functional synthesis are unlikely. And so the picture looks gloomy, but then there is also some good news in the sense that we have been able to show that if you represent the specification phi in some special normal forms, this is something that we call synthesis negation normal form, then indeed we can guarantee polynomial time and space synthesis. And recently we were able to sharpen this result by saying that a specification is polynomial time or size synthesizable if and only if it can be compiled in polynomial time or size to a special normal form of circuits called, whatever this big name here, subset and realizable negation normal form. So this actually gives a circuit level characterization of when a specification is efficiently synthesizable time-wise or space-wise. So I will not get into the details of these normal forms. That's perhaps the subject of another talk. But let me directly come here saying that, well, given all of these difficulties and some ray of hope, it turns out that this guess check repair paradigm has turned out to be a very useful paradigm for solving this problem. So what is this paradigm? So here what we do is we take the specification. So henceforth, I'm not going to make a distinction between the different inputs. I'll just denote them as 1x, and the outputs I'm going to represent as y1 through yn. So we take the specification and then we generate some candidate Skolem functions. This is, you can think of as intelligent guessing. But as I'll show that it is not just guesswork. I mean, we also ensure that some properties hold for the candidate Skolem functions. So we basically obtain some candidate Skolem functions. These may not be true Skolem functions. So we have a check which checks if this is a correct Skolem function. And if the answer is yes, we say, okay, we've solved the problem. If the answer is no, then we actually obtain a counterexample that why is this vector of functions not serving as Skolem functions for the given specification. And then we repair the candidate Skolem functions based on this counterexample. And then we perform the check with the repaired Skolem functions, and we continue to do this. So of course, this might look like that there's a loop which might go on forever. But then we can also give some progress guarantees that every time we are going around this loop, we are coming at least one step closer to a correct Skolem function for at least one of these functions. So eventually this whole thing must stop and we will get the right Skolem functions. But, I mean, theoretically, of course, this iteration can go on for a very long time. Our experiments show that this convergence happens pretty fast for most examples. Okay. So let's first talk about how to guess the candidate Skolem functions, okay? And to simplify things, I will start off with a simple case where I have just one output. So the cardinality of y is 1. So I want to find an fx such that there exists y phi of xy is semantically equivalent to phi of xfx, right? So this is the same problem. Of course, there is a universal quantification over x. So, if this is semantically equivalent, then it should hold for all x. So I want to find an f which satisfies this property for all x. All right. So here is a pictorial depiction of what's going on. So let us say that, and this x could be, as many variables as you want. So let us say this is an abstract representation of the set of all valuations of x, some Boolean hypercube. And then I could ask that what are the values of x within this which will forbid me from setting y to 1. So we can't set y to 1 when x takes on these values, because if we set y to 1 when x takes on these values, the specification gets falsified. So what are these values of x which forbid me from setting y to 1? So this is actually not very hard to determine. I take the specification, set y to 1, and then just negate it. So clearly these are the values of x such that at those values of x, if I set y to 1, then the specification gets falsified. And here is a simple example, 2 clauses in phi, and then I just set y to 1 and then take the negation. And this gives me the set of valuations of x for which I can't set y to 1. As you can see, if x1 is 0 and x2 is 0, if x1 is 0, I can't set y to 1. And right. And similarly, if x2 is also 0, sorry, if x1 is 0, as well as x2 is 0, then basically this becomes y and negation y. So of course, I can't set y to 1. I mean, in this particular case, I can't set y to 0 as well, but certainly I can't set y to 1, right? So this is a straightforward thing. And I could then do the same thing by asking, well, what are the values of x which forbid me from setting y to 0? And so it's the same trick. So you set y to 0 in the specification, negate the specification, and there you get that, well, you can't set y to 0. In the same example that we saw earlier, you can't set y to 0 if x1 is 0, because if x1 is 0, this becomes y. This clause becomes y. Okay. And so if I superimpose these two things, I get, so these red dots are the dots where I can't set y to 1. These green dots are where I can't set y to 0. And these yellow dots are where I can't set y to either 1 or 0. So, for these values of x, there is nothing that I can do to y to make the specification satisfied. And these white dots are all the points where I can set y to either 1 or 0, and the specification would be satisfied. So in general, this is the picture where, for some values, I can't set y to 1. For some values, I can't set y to 0. There are some values where I can set it to either, and there are some values where I can set it to neither. And what we would like to do is, we would like to understand what does a Skolem function look like in terms of these sets. And, it's not very hard to show that every Skolem function for y, this is the single variable case, single output variable case, it must evaluate to 1 in, because it can't be 0 here in this green part. So it must evaluate to 1 here. It can't evaluate to 1 here in this red part. So it must evaluate to 0 here. So it must evaluate to 1 in delta minus gamma, this green part. It must evaluate to 0 in gamma minus delta, this red part. And it should really be an interpolant of these two regions. And any interpolant of these two regions can serve as a Skolem function. And that's a result that we already have. And, so of course, there could be many, many interpolants. It turns out that there are some specific interpolants which are very easy to calculate. And one specific interpolant is you just exclude the entire gamma. Remember, gamma was the set where I couldn't set it to 1. So I say, okay, I'll set it to 1 everywhere outside gamma. So this turns out to be an easy interpolant. Or remember, we had said that delta was the set where I couldn't set it to 0. So I can say that let's just set it to 1 over here. And I don't, it's set to 0 everywhere outside. So there are these simple interpolants that I can calculate, which is take the formula, set the y variable to 1, or take the formula, set the y variable to 0 and negate it. And kind of that's, those are easy interpolants to obtain. And since we know that every interpolant will serve as a Skolem function, so, this gives us an easy solution for one output variable. And you look at this solution, this is like really, very nice, which is saying take the specification and whatever variable you are trying to synthesize, just set that to 1. you will get a function in terms of the inputs, and that function will serve as a correct Skolem function for that specific variable for which you are trying to synthesize the Skolem function. So there is an easy solution for one output variable, and in fact, we will focus on this easy solution, but of course, whatever we say can be generalized to this other solution as well. Okay, so that was for one variable case. Now, what happens if I have two variables and then many variables? So let's see what happens if I have two variables. So suppose I have a relational spec which has two output variables. Now here the thing becomes slightly more complicated because the Skolem function for y2 can end up depending on what we have chosen as the Skolem function for y1. And here's a simple example. I have this one clause, which is our usual CNF style clause, and there's this other clause, which is an XOR clause. And this itself is telling you that, what you choose for y2 has to depend on what you choose for y1. Okay. So y2 must be negation y1. So I cannot synthesize the Skolem functions for y1 and y2 independently. Okay. So, if I ask that for what values of x can we not set y1 to 1 or can we not set y1 to 0, here that will depend on the value for y2, right? Because y1 and y2 are interrelated over here. So if I ask, yeah.
So Prahlad just wants to clarify that the Skolem function is still a guess.
So we are trying to, no. In the previous slide, this was not a guess. For a single variable, single output variable specification, every
no, Supratik, I was saying that because there is still a path where you can't set it to 0 or 1, there's still a guess and you still have to repair it at some point.
You mean this yellow part?
Yeah.
No, there is nothing that can be repaired in this point, because if your x is over here, this is like the prime number. That if you give me a prime number, there is no factorization. So
got it.
So it does not matter what I generate over here. I mean, nothing here would have worked.
Okay, thanks.
Right? Yeah. All right. So where were we? Yeah. So if I'm going to ask the same question, that for what values of x can I not set y1 to 1 or 0, this now has to depend on y2. If I apply the same technique that I did earlier, I will take the specification set y1 to 1, but then I have to ask that, if I'm saying that I cannot set y1 to 0, it means that there's nothing I can do for y2, right? I mean, either it has to depend on y2, or if I want to make it independent of y2, I have to quantify out this y2. So I have to say that there does not exist any value for y2 such that once I set y1 to 1, I can satisfy the specification. Now, in this particular example, it turns out that this simplifies to 0 or the false case, which means that there is no value of x where you cannot at all set it to 1. And similarly over here. And, once you have obtained these things, I mean, in general, you can see that there are two options. Either you keep this Skolem function in terms of y2, or you have to do this quantification of y2 by saying that, well, I want to know for all values of y2, what do I get here, right? So if I want to get y1 just in terms of x, then I really will have to ask this question that if I set y1 to 1, then, no matter what value I put for y2, the specification is not satisfied. And whatever that simplifies to, I'll have to take that as, this gamma that we talked about earlier, and similarly for delta. Okay. And now if I'm able to do this, from these two, I can again find the Skolem function for y1, just like what I did earlier. Any interpolant between them, in particular, this interpolant should work. Remember, our interpolant was negation gamma, right? So this interpolant was negation gamma. So I'm just using that same strategy here. And now that I have found a Skolem function for y1, I've quantified out the y2s. So Skolem function for y1 is indeed in terms of just x. Now that I've found the Skolem function for y1 in terms of x, what I can do is I can substitute that back into the specification. And now the specification looks like a single output specification where the only output is y2 and the inputs are x. And then I can apply the same technique that I did earlier to obtain y2 as a function of x. Okay. So for two cases, I can sort of do this using this involved way, where I'm basically applying the same trick for synthesizing a single output variable Skolem function, a Skolem function for a single output variable. But I'm having to do this quantification when I'm trying to express one variable by not referring to the other variables. Okay. So in general, I guess this could be the strategy. This is, whatever we have discussed so far suggests this is a strategy. That suppose I have a specification which has m variables, y1 through ym, and I'm dividing it into two parts. The first variable y1 and the block of other variables y2 to ym. And the Skolem function for y2 to ym will depend on that for y1 in general. So we can ask that for what values of x can we not set y1 to 1. And then, if I want this directly in terms of x, I'll have to go and quantify out all of these y1, y2 to ym. Okay. But once I have obtained that, I can go back and I can find the Skolem function as an interpolant of these two. And then I can substitute that into the specification and then now split this y2 to m into two parts, y2 and y3 to m, and then repeat this process until I find the Skolem function for each variable in terms of just x. Now, while this looks like, in theory it works, but there is some huge drawbacks of this approach. And the first thing is that you need to do this existential quantification over long sequences of outputs. And then you need to do this nested compositions, right? I mean, you're going to get one specification here and that you have to again substitute the specification for y2 and so on and so forth. So these nested compositions also lead to blow up of the representation. So the question we ask ourselves is that can we work around these drawbacks? Note that if I could do this, I would get the Skolem function straight away, directly. There would not be any guessing, checking, repairing. But of course, these have these drawbacks. And so we are asking that, can we work around these drawbacks? And the guess, check, repair paradigm is really to work around these drawbacks. Okay, so here is a useful observation as we try to do this, that suppose I could linearly order the outputs, and instead of expressing ym, ym or y1, depending on which side of the order you're starting from, directly as a function of x, why not express it as a function of x and all the other outputs? Now, this should be fairly straightforward, because all I'm saying is that I'm going to treat these other outputs as just like they were inputs. And I'm going to synthesize this ym as function of the inputs and these other outputs treated just like inputs, right? So suppose I could do that. Then what I could do is I could plug whatever Skolem function for ym I get in terms of all of these in the specification. And then I would be left with only these variables, x and y1 through ym minus 1, right? Remember that if I express ym as a function of x and y1 through ym minus 1, then when I plug in this function into my original specification, I no longer have ym. Wherever ym was there, that only depends on x and y1 through ym minus 1. So now I have a new specification which has only x and y1 through ym minus 1. And now I can repeat this process saying, let's express ym minus 1 in terms of y1 through ym minus 2, and finally y1 as g1x, right? And you see that if I actually have these, then in some sense, I have used only the one variable synthesis technique at each step, but I have also had to do some composition. Every time I do this one variable synthesis, I have to then compose, but I have effectively gotten rid of the existential quantification. The composition is still there. And what I have obtained at the end is not ym as a function of x and ym minus 1 as a function of x, but ym as a function of x and y1 through ym minus 1, and so on. But then, at the end, if I have y1 as a function of x only, I can substitute this into y2, and I'll get y2 also as a function of x, and then I can substitute y1 and y2 into y3, and I can get y3 only as a function of x. So by doing this reverse substitution, I can actually get all the functions. And it is not hard to show that if you have an x input, y output circuit computing the desired Skolem function vector, basically if you have x inputs and y outputs in your specification, then if you follow this technique, then you can get the Skolem functions for all outputs in terms of only x using a circuit where the number of gates is bounded by some summation of the number of gates in each of these plus some term, and the number of wires, the interconnections are bounded by the summation of the number of wires in these and some quadratic term. So what this tells you is that if I can solve these problems, which are really single variable Skolem function synthesis problems, followed by substitution, then from the solutions of that, I can actually systematically construct a solution where all the Skolem functions are expressed in terms of x. And therefore, this tells us that, well, it's good enough to just compute these things and then just combine those things to obtain each Skolem function as an output of x. So of course here, what are the two steps? I mean, one is synthesizing Skolem function for a one output specification that we know is easy, and then doing the composition. Now this composition can still blow up because I am having to repeatedly compose. I am having to compose on a compose and so on. So so there is still this source of blow up. I mean, the lower bounds that we showed are not going to go away so easily. So there's going to be still this source of blow up that remains, and this is where we say that, well, we can try to guess compositionally. So instead of trying to find out what these things will look like precisely, we are going to sort of use some approximations over there. Okay, so what does this compositional guessing look like? It says that, well, if your specification was phi1 and phi2, right? Then what you can do is you can find out the gamma in phi1, you can find out the gamma and delta in phi1, you can find out the gamma and delta in phi2. So basically treat each of these as a specification and try to solve the problems for them. So you find out the gamma and delta sets for here. And this kind of looks like this, that let us say for phi1, the gamma set looks like this, and for phi2, the gamma set looks like this. And for phi1, the delta set looks like this, and for phi2, the delta set looks like this. And now you will notice that, remember what was this gamma set? The gamma set said that gamma 1 are all those values of x where you can't set y to 1 if you are to satisfy phi1, right? Now, if you can't set y to 1 and satisfy phi1, then certainly you can't set y to 1 and satisfy phi1 and phi2, right? So this entire gamma 1 is going to be part of the overall gamma of phi, and similarly for gamma 2, because gamma 2 are the values of x for which you can't set y to 1 and make phi2 evaluate to true. But if you can't make phi2 evaluate to true, you can't make phi1 and phi2 evaluate to true. So all of these gamma 1 and gamma 2 will be part of gamma for phi, and similarly for delta 1 and delta 2. But it turns out that the gamma for phi is not just the union of gamma 1 and gamma 2. Similarly, the delta for phi is not just the union of delta 1 and delta 2. It's an under approximation. So the real gamma could have more things here. The real delta could have more things here. So what we can show is that the union will under approximate the real gamma, and the union will under approximate the real delta if your specification was a conjunction of two subspecifications. If your specification was a disjunction of two subspecifications, it actually turns out that we get exactly the gamma by conjoining the gammas of the two subspecifications, and we get the exact delta by conjoining the delta of the two subspecifications. So, it looks like that if we can compute the gammas and deltas of the subspecifications, then we can combine them to get approximations to the gamma and delta of the overall specification. And from there, we may be able to guess the Skolem function of the overall circuit, right? Now, but what if calculating these gammas and deltas are themselves hard? The subspecifications themselves may be hard. Long sequences of quantification are of concern. So here, as we said, we are going to use under approximations if we can't calculate them exactly. So we are going to use under approximations, because with under approximations, if I under approximate gamma 1 and if I under approximate gamma 2, I get an under approximation of gamma. But if I over approximate gamma and if I over approximate gamma 2, I don't necessarily get an over approximation for gamma, because the implication goes this way. So we choose to work with under approximations because this compositional view tells us that we can only get under approximations using this compositional reasoning. So we basically can work with under approximations, and that is the right thing to work with. Okay, so how do we work with that? So basically we do this, we say, okay, I'm going to work with under approximations. Let's say this little gamma is the under approximation of the real gamma, little delta is the under approximation of the real delta. So when I take the disjunction of the little gammas, then I get an under approximation of the disjunction of the big gammas, which I know is an under approximation of gamma. So this disjunction of little gammas continues to be an under approximation of the what I wanted to calculate. And similarly for disjunction, the conjunction of the under approximations implies the conjunction of the real gammas. And for this kind of composition, we know the conjunction of the real gammas is the real gamma of the overall specification. Okay, so we basically use this. And now how do we calculate these under approximations themselves? So here, we use a very simple trick. We say, okay, just take the specification, draw it out as a tree, and then, look at all the things that you're trying to quantify out in your long sequence of quantification. So suppose I'm trying to quantify out y1 and y2. So if I set all the leaves which have either y1 or y1 bar, or y2 and y2 bar as 0, then I'm definitely going to get an under approximation of what this was. And if I set all of these to 1, I'm going to get an over approximation. And once again, this just follows from the fact that the result of quantifying this is really setting 0, 0, 0, 1 and all of these things. And if the circuit is monotone, basically I have only AND and OR gates upwards in the circuit, negations are all at the leaves, then I can just set the leaves to the smallest possible values to get the under approximation, and I can set the leaves to the biggest possible values to get the over approximation. So this allows us to get whichever way we want to work, but of course our goal is to work with under approximations. So yeah, let me not get into this. This is just saying that this is just writing out what is depicted in the picture, that if you set the leaves appropriately, you can get the under approximations and over approximations. Okay, so this tells us how we might be able to get approximations to the Skolem function. So these are our guesses of the Skolem functions. And then, we want to check that, maybe our approximation is already good enough, or maybe it is not. So, once we have obtained some candidate Skolem functions, I want to check, is it the case that for all x, remember this was the definition of our Skolem functions. Is it the case that for all x, there exists y phi xy is equivalent to phi x of x? But in order to check this, it looks like we need a QBF solver because there is this quantifier alternation over here. And the question is, can we avoid using that? And we were actually able to find a way to avoid using that, essentially by replicating this specification twice, and we construct this propositional formula. So what does this propositional formula say? It says that for the given x, there is a way to satisfy the specification, but if you set the y's as the given functions, as the proposed candidate Skolem functions, then the specification gets falsified, right? So for the given x, it is indeed possible to find y's which satisfy the specification, but if you set the y's to the proposed functions, then it doesn't satisfy the specification. And if you can find a satisfying assignment for this, then you actually have a counterexample. Then we know that this is not true. So, this reduction to propositional satisfiability helps because we can now use propositional satisfiability solvers. And of course, if this formula is unsatisfiable, it means that every time I have an x for which there's some y that satisfies it, this also evaluates to true. Every time this evaluates to true, this also evaluates to true, because that is how this formula becomes unsatisfiable, right? So which means that every time for a given x, there is some y, for that same x, fx also works to satisfy the specification. And
so Supratik, just to interrupt, sorry, you have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah. I'll try to wrap up. Yeah. Okay. So what this means is that if I have the satisfying assignment of this error formula, then I can use that as a counter example. Okay. So let me just say this at a slightly high level. Why is it a counter example? Because with that x, I know that there is a certain y which satisfies the specification, but for that x, I know that the values of fx that I'm getting doesn't satisfy the specification. So what we do is we basically say that, let me just go over this slightly faster. So, we obtain this satisfying assignment of the error formula, which is a counterexample. And then what we do is we generalize it. What does this generalization mean? This generalization means that this satisfying assignment is giving me specific values for the variables. So I tried to come up with a function which is such that this satisfying assignment satisfies this function. So mu generalizes sigma. And it is also the case that for any satisfying assignment of mu, that error formula that we came up with, this epsilon, would be violated, right? So basically, there is, if for any satisfying assignment of mu, it is not possible to use that satisfying assignment to satisfy the specification because the error formula gets satisfied. So therefore, this becomes a generalized counterexample. And the real thing that we are saying here is that we could work with this individual counterexample. It's just that the number of repair iterations would become many, many more. If we work with generalized counterexample, we are potentially catching more counterexamples together, and so we can iterate fewer times. So the repair is basically that. Once again, let me just So the repair is basically this. Whatever this generalized counterexample is, we say that okay, I guess maybe this is a good picture to see what is happening in the repair. Is that, remember, we had said that I might be getting gamma 1 and gamma 2, but there is these other parts that are left behind. Similarly, I might be getting delta 1 and delta 2, and there's other parts that are left behind. These counter examples that I'm getting are telling me what these other parts are. So I could keep adding them one at a time. That's also fine. The number of iterations will be many. But if I can add them a group at a time, then the number of iterations would be lesser. And once I have filled up these gaps, then I'm done. Then that error formula will become satisfiable. So that's the role of the counterexample guided repair. It does find these gaps. Each counterexample correspond to something in this gap. And then as we union these with the gamma and delta functions, so if here, as I've shown, the repair is really the union part of it. So this is how we repair. We repair by unioning the mu. If we had used gamma, we repair by unioning delta, unioning mu to delta if we had used delta. And so this is what we call expansion-based repair, because we are expanding those gamma and delta functions. Okay, and this provides a simple argument for termination, because there are only finitely many things that got left out, and at each iteration I'm covering at least one of them, and so after some time all of them will get covered. Okay, so can we always find mu? It turns out that there is always a way to generalize mu, and let me not get into the details of that. And by generalizing mu, actually we can update multiple Skolem functions, because we are now potentially capturing multiple counterexamples together. So here is the experimental comparison. This is one of the state-of-the-art tools called KDET until a few years back. Today it is no longer one. And this is our tool which uses this policy that we just talked about. And what you see is that this is a very mixed picture, and these are different categories of benchmarks that we used. So you see that these have really complementary strengths. There are timeouts that happen for each one, which can be solved by the other, and so on and so forth. I just also want to mention that this same paradigm has also been used, this guess check repair, in another recent work by Priyanka Golia, Kuldeep Mil, and Shubhajit Roy. And in their case, they guess the Skolem functions using machine learning techniques. In our case, we guess the Skolem functions using under approximations and compositional reasoning. And this is a very interesting technique that they have proposed. They basically say that, well, we want to find out what the candidate Skolem functions are. So let's sample some solutions of the original specification. And from those samples, let's find out decision trees for each of the outputs in terms of the inputs and the other outputs, as I showed earlier. And the nice part about this is that it's okay not to match this data exactly in your decision tree. It can have two-sided errors, because in any case, these are going to be repaired later on. And it often results in small decision trees. Their experiments show that this works very nicely. The check uses the same error formula that I showed earlier. And their repair uses also a very interesting technique, which is the unsatisfiable course. So you basically find out a satisfying assignment of the error formula. This shows that there's a counterexample. And then you say that, well, if I want to repair this column function fi such that this yi is not equal to the yi prime. I mean, this is the true solution and this is the erroneous solution. And they, so once again, let me not get into this, but basically you can construct a formula such that from the unsatisfiable core of this formula, you can extract what to add to the guessed column functions so that they now have, so that it's one step closer to the right column function. And in their paper, they actually provide this very nice cactus plot. And this is BFSS, which is what I showed earlier. That is this purple thing over here. Caret is the red thing, so caret trails behind. Caret goes ahead in some of the things. And Manthan, which is their tool, as you can see, really is quite effective. So it beats even BFSS. And so, what this shows is that, the guess check repair paradigm, I think, would have different instantiations of guessing and repairing. The check part looks like is more or less the same. And depending on, how much you optimize the guessing part as well as the repairing part, you can get tools that actually solve this for fairly large problem instances. And the latest paper, I think, Priyanka Golia and her co-authors have takes this even further. They have been able to use this guess check repair paradigm even more effectively. So I know I've overshot a little bit. So let me stop there. If there are any questions, I'll be very happy to take them.
Thanks, Supratik. Any questions?
I'm not able to see the chat, so if there are some, please let me know.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat. I'll tell you if I see anything.
If I'll ask a question.
Srivatsan,
Yeah.
Thanks, Supratik. So thanks for very nice
not much was understandable, so there are not many questions.
No. Yeah. So yeah. I was wondering if you restrict your application to say LTL synthesis, is there a way? Is there a possibility of a more refined guess approach, like where the number of iterations may reduce?
More refined guess based on the specification.
If I assume that my formulas that I take are coming from LTL synthesis applications. Okay. And now, is there some more structure in the formula that helps me to guess these? You have this guess part, right?
Yeah. So, so honestly, I don't know that because I have not tried that out. But what is for sure is that so actually, the approach that we had taken was trying to say that you have to guess your Skolem functions so that they still satisfy some properties. They're still under approximations. And then we can repair them by adding things to them. And that helps in some way, but it also hurts in some way. So for our initial guesses, maybe if, in your case, as you're saying, that if you already know that some move would have helped, right? Then I know that would be an under approximation, and I can add that, right?
I see.
Right, but I think that the recent work by Priyanka Golia and Kuldeep Mehl and Shubhajit Roy that has really taken this one step further, saying that it is not necessary to just look at under approximations. You can have even two-sided errors, and these can be repaired later on. And I think that is very interesting, because that just says that, if you have some idea that maybe from the structure of the formula, maybe from the domain that you're trying to, from the domain from which the synthesis problem comes, that, maybe from expert knowledge that some kinds of techniques might work. So you can just throw all of those into the initial guessed function, and then it is possible to repair them. I mean, we can check them through the error formula, and if there is a counterexample, and now counterexamples can be of both types, the things that were left out and things that were also included but should not have been included, and we can now repair it both ways. I mean, their work is very nice in that sense, that it allows two-sided error repair, which really, makes the burden of coming up with the initial guess much lesser. So I haven't worked with anything specific for LTL formulas, but I mean, if looking at the formula, if you can, or if some, some kind of structural analysis of the formula already tells you that there are possibly some solutions that work in some cases, I think it's okay to throw those in and let this entire process of counterexample guided repair figure it out. Whether that works, maybe that works in all cases. The error formula will tell you. Maybe it does not, in which case we can find out exactly where it does not and what repair to do for that. So, I mean, I of course had to rush through this last part, but I mean, basically the repair that they do allows you to both add and subtract, right? So basically this adding is done when you realize that something has been left out. The subtraction is done when you realize that something has been overshot. And I think this is a fairly effective technique. The way that we did the repair was only to add, because we were guaranteed that we were always using under approximations. So any error comes about because this under approximation has not captured everything. So we know that whatever counterexample we have, that should just be added. But I think this limitation has been removed. So I guess the answer to your question, I didn't really answer, but I don't think there is anything specific that I can say about LTL. I think this,
sure. Yeah.
But it's
but it does. Yeah. So you add some domain knowledge as much as possible, if possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So your guess can be now, more carefree guess, saying that I think this might work, so let's just throw that in. And of course, one could say let's start with completely random guesses. Even that is fine as a the algorithm will eventually terminate and if you give sufficient resources, but that might just enter into too many iterations. And so good guesses certainly work. The interesting part is, maybe I didn't highlight this, that in our experiments, we actually found that almost, more than 85% of our benchmarks, the initial guess itself was correct. Okay, the initial guess. So what it means is that when you do this compositional reasoning, yes, you can worry about worst case situations, pathological situations where things get left out. But if you do this initial reasoning, like we were doing compositional reasoning. So if you do this initial compositional reasoning correct with under approximations, then it often just suffices for, for 85% of our cases, the initial guess itself was correct. For the other cases, we needed iterations. I think that same observation comes out from the other work also, that most of the initial guesses are already correct. So, it does matter how you choose your initial guess, but if you do it carefully, a completely random guess would be bad. But if you do it carefully, it's quite effective. Yeah. So the worst case behavior of all of this is bad because there are hard lower bounds. We can't escape those, right? So all we are trying to ask is, does this work in practice? And and you know, when I said that, you know, almost 85% of our cases work in the first iteration itself, we have subsequently gone ahead and tried to investigate why is that the case. And you know, something that I showed very early on, that we are now able to characterize actually exactly when would it be solvable efficiently. And it turns out that most of the examples that we have are already in that form.
Okay. Okay.
So some earlier slide, yeah. So this last result gives us a characterization.
Okay.
So
Thanks, Pratik.
Yeah. Okay. So it's, I think, getting to 10:15. We have a short break, so maybe we should stop here and people can.
Yeah, I apologize for overshooting.
No. It was a nice talk, so it was forgiven. Okay. So thanks again, Supratik. And I guess we have a 15-minute break before the next session starts. So see you guys. Go and grab your chai and come back.
Yeah, so I'm available if somebody wants to ask me more questions. So
okay, great. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Pratik, so I have some more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. So is there? So you've done this for Boolean. So does this also work for other theories like
temporal? Oh no. You mean bit vectors and all of them?
Yeah, like linear arithmetic. Like if I want to, let me try to be more clear in the. So you're given so you want to synthesize some other logic formula, say a formula in linear arithmetic.
Correct.
I mean, and say let's say x1 to xn are, integers, and y1 to ym are again numbers. So you want to find a formula that. Now, in this case, can this paradigm be used?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and you know, Akshay and I are. I don't know if Akshay is in the audience, but Akshay and I are working on that right now. So let me tell you a few things that we know already there. So if you take linear rational arithmetic, then it can be done. The problem can be solved, and it has been solved earlier. We didn't solve it. Okay. If you take integers and allow addition and multiplication, then it's already uncomputable.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and of course, for bit vectors, it can be done, right? And once again, some people have done it.
Okay.
So this basically says that as you try to extend it to other theories, so actually yesterday the talk that Vrunda gave on string constraints,
right.
you know, one could, actually, is Vrunda around? I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think she's around. I mean, I wanted to ask her that question that, you know, I mean, those constraints can, the string constraints that she was talking about can also be viewed as specifications. Right. And she was worried about satisfiability, which of course is the first question to be worried about. But the next question to worry about is, can I get a model? And how hard is it to get the model? Right. So, so I think what her work shows is that, you know, I can also ask this problem, but of course, you know, the setting is slightly different because I guess over there, everything is existentially quantified. I mean, they're just asking, does there exist an X such that the string constraint is satisfied? Yeah. Whereas what we are asking is that for all values of some inputs, does there exist some outputs? But I think that work is kind of in this flavor. I think a natural extension of that work would be to say that, what if I have parameterized string constraints, where the parameters are some inputs that I can provide, and can I find the witnesses to the existential quantifiers in terms of those parameters? Okay. So I think for strings, certain things can be done. And I think certainly the work that they have done is very interesting in that domain. For linear rational arithmetic, this work is already done. For integers, it very soon gets into undecidability. And actually, there is a very interesting question to ask here, that we are talking about Skolem functions, right? Now, for the Boolean case, I can say, well, a Skolem function should be another Boolean function. It should be a Boolean circuit, right? Now, if you talk about, let us say, strings, or if you talk about some other theory, are we saying that the Skolem function should be a term in that logic's vocabulary, or are we saying the Skolem function should be something that can be computed by a Turing machine, which eventually gives me something in the domain of that theory? It need not be a term, okay? And I think the sort of most stark example of that is the existential theory of reals, right? Tarski's theory. I mean, I can always write x squared is equal to 2, but I can't express the solution of this in the language of that, in the vocabulary of that theory. Square root is not in the vocabulary.
Right.
So there are these questions that come up when I'm talking about Skolem functions, is that the function should be able to take an arbitrary element of the domain. The question is, how do I represent an arbitrary element of the domain, right? How do I represent an arbitrary real number? I mean, there cannot be any, countable way of representing arbitrary real numbers, right? So when I'm talking about a Skolem function, I need to provide it an input, and it needs to generate an output. Now, what will be the representation of this input, and what will be the representation of this output, right? So this also sort of makes us wonder that, computing explicit Skolem functions, even as Turing machines, forget about terms in a logic, is not always possible, because I cannot represent arbitrary real numbers. So how do I even provide inputs to my function? And it cannot compute arbitrary real numbers, right? Because there's no way to represent them. I mean, I'm using the usual Turing machine model of computation. So I think this certainly can be extended to other theories, but one has to do that extension carefully, because not everything even makes sense.
Correct.
I mean, strings, rational numbers, I can represent them. Integers, I can represent them. So it certainly makes sense to ask there that even if I don't have a term in the logic, do I have a Turing machine which computes the Skolem? And very soon you hit uncomputability. I mean, it doesn't take too much to hit uncomputability. So we have to work within well carved out theories. And the Boolean is kind of the simplest of it, but still, I mean, it turns out to be hard enough. But the simplest in the sense that here all these questions are already sorted out. I mean, we know how to represent inputs, we know how to represent outputs, we know how to represent functions and all of that.
Supradeep, I have one question.
Yeah.
So you are talking about the algorithm point. So I'm talking about not theory, algorithm point of view. So what kind of algorithm are you focusing on? Because because in machine learning approaches, because guessing, whatever she was saying, that guessing things, there are different types of algorithm, like clustering or different types. What kind of algorithm you're focusing on this?
So are you saying what kind of machine learning algorithms are used for guessing?
Yeah, guessing.
Yeah. So this is, this is not our work. This is the work from Priyanka.
Okay.
But I can tell you, I think I understand that paper well enough. But certainly I'm not the author of that. But so, for example, what they do is they say that you're given a specification, right? Phi of xy.
Yeah.
So you can randomly sample the solution space of this specification, right? And each such random sample will give you some values of x and some values of y, right? Your specification is phi of xy,
Hmm.
right? So a satisfying assignment of it will give you some value of x and value of y. So if you randomly sample the solution space, let us say uniformly randomly or weighted randomly sample this, I think they do weighted randomly sample the solution space, you're going to get a bunch of XY pairs. Okay, that's your data. Now from these XY pairs, you're trying to learn the Y's as function of X.
Okay.
Okay, and I think they use decision trees to learn Y's as function of X's. So decision tree learning is, of course, very, very well studied in machine learning. And the idea is that they want to get small decision trees, because remember, these are initial guesses. They may not be correct. So they don't want to invest too much in the initial decision tree. So they want to get small decision trees, which serve as initial guesses. So these guesses are obtained from the data, which is weighted random samples of this solution space of the specification, and from their decision trees constructed for the individual Y's in terms of X's.
Okay.
Realizing it, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking, that the way that Srivasan want to use that structure, I don't think we are able to use the structure correctly, the more information that we have about the LTL, but in some sense by this providing these explicit dependencies, we are able to use those information.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so this seems like a nice answer. Yeah.
Srivasan, yeah.
Yeah, I was listening.
Yeah.
So yesterday I gave a talk about the like program synthesis as a dependency quantified formula theory, and in this, if you remember, the dependency quantified formula theory, we have this Hankin dependencies, and Hankin dependencies in the sense a particular extensionally quantified variable yi. Instead of depending on all the universally quantified variables, it has some subset on which it has to depend. It cannot use, or it cannot in some sense see the other universally quantified apart from its explicit defined dependencies. So from there, we can just use this this LTL representation. We can use, we can explicitly define these dependencies, and we can use the structural or some other information about them.
Okay, I see. Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Priyanka. I think, yeah, I have not fully understood all the details of the DQBF work. That I still have to go through that. Maybe a few more presentations from you, but it's very nice work.